everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode.
We're jumping straight into a really significant area today. The possibility of a major trade agreement between the United States and the European Union.
Especially against the backdrop of these, newly announced tariffs.
Exactly. It feels like we're trying to make sense of a pretty complex, shifting global economic landscape.
Absolutely. And what's particularly interesting is the recent uptick in optimism surrounding this, especially after that meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni.
Right.
So our goal in this deep dive is to really understand where this optimism is coming from, what's driving it, and, what the various perspectives are on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay. And to get a handle on this, we're looking at recent reports covering what both leaders said, some expert analysis trying to unpack the situation, and a broader look at how the EU and maybe even the UK are viewing their trade priorities in all of this.
And as you listen, you're probably thinking about the implications, right? How might these potential deals actually change things economically, politically? We're here to help piece together what seems truly significant.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at that meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Meloni. That seems to be what sparked this fresh wave of, optimism.
Yeah.
Now, the timing is key here, isn't it? This happened after President Trump announced those new tariffs.
It did, although he did put that 90-day pause on them specifically for the EU.
Right, that pause.
Precisely. That 90-day window is crucial, and Meloni's visit fell right within it. What's fascinating here is the very upbeat tone both leaders adopted about a potential trade agreement.
Upbeat how?
Well, Trump staked there would be a deal, 100%, he said, and Meloni echoed that, saying she was sure an agreement could be reached.
100%. That sounds pretty confident. It sounds like a positive encounter overall.
Uh-huh.
I understand Meloni was the first European leader to meet with President Trump since these tariffs were announced.
That's right, first one. And it seems she's kind of positioning herself as someone who can help de-escalate this potential trade war.
Right. A sort of mediator.
That's a really insightful way to put it. Meloni appears to be leveraging her personal connection with Trump. And they do share some common ground, don't they? Particularly on conservative viewpoints.
Immigration, that sort of thing.
Yeah, immigration and what they've both called woke ideology. That shared perspective could, it could help build a connection.
And President Trump was apparently very vocal in his praise for her.
Oh, absolutely. Calling her fantastic, a great talent, even one of the real leaders of the world. That level of endorsement from a U.S. president is definitely noteworthy.
Definitely.
And Meloni, on her part, invited Trump to visit Rome. She even suggested he might meet with other European leaders there.
Interesting. Could that be a significant diplomatic route?
Yeah.
Especially given the reported tension between Trump and the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen?
It really could be. It's almost as if Meloni is offering to act as an intermediary, to bridge that gap, maybe?
Yeah, bridging a gap. Okay. And we also heard about some specific commitments Meloni made during this meeting.
We did. Italy is apparently planning to increase its imports of liquefied natural gas LNG from the U.S.
Okay.
And Italian companies are looking at making pretty substantial investments, up to $10 billion in the United States.
10 billion euros. Wow.
Plus, Italy is aiming to meet NATO's 2% GDP target for defense spending by June. So yeah, quite a bit put on the table.
That sounds like quite a lot. Gestures of goodwill, perhaps? Potential concessions?
Could be interpreted that way, yes. But it's important to balance this with Trump's own statements, right? He mentioned being in no rush to finalize any deal. And he asserted that everybody wants to make a deal. He also made a point of highlighting the income, or rather, the revenue the U.S. is generating from the existing tariffs. Billions and billions of dollars, as he put it.
So Meloni's making offers, but Trump feels he's negotiating from strength, using the tariffs as leverage.
That's how it appears. Leveraging those existing tariffs seems like a key bargaining chip, which, makes a swift and entirely favorable deal for the EU maybe less likely.
Which makes sense when you consider Italy's situation. They're a big export economy, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. is a huge market for them.
Exactly. Second largest export market. So Meloni acknowledged they are in a difficult moment and stressed how important it is to protect Italian exports.
Understandable.
And her potential role as this intermediary for the EU becomes even more interesting, given that apparent frostiness between Trump and von der Leyen we mentioned.
Right.
And the fact that EU trade negotiators reportedly haven't even been presented with the US's specific demands yet. Well, that just underscores the complexity.
And maybe explains why some in Europe might see Maloney as perhaps the main channel to get their concerns heard right now.
Precisely.
Okay, so that gives us a picture of the Trump-Maloney meeting, but what's the broader reaction? What's the perspective coming from the European Union itself in response to all this? Surely it's not all just optimism.
Oh, you're absolutely right. The initial reaction within the EU to Trump's tariff announcement was far from optimistic.
No.
No.
Right.
In fact, some described it using words like outrage and fury. There were immediate worries about a potential escalation.
Escalation of tariffs.
Yes, leading to what some called a downward economic spiral, something that would harm both the U.S. and the global economy. You know, where tariffs lead to retaliation, trade shrinks, growth suffers.
And I gather there's a view in the EU that American consumers themselves would end up bearing the heaviest burden of these tariffs.
That's a very widely held view, yes. Some within the EU even called for targeted trade measures against what they termed Trump's allies and the American oligarchs.
Strong words.
Very. The fundamental concern is that these tariffs will just increase costs for everyone, driving up prices not just for the specific goods targeted, but more broadly.
So the European business community must be feeling pretty anxious about this potential conflict too.
Definitely. Organizations representing businesses, trade unions as well, they've expressed serious worries. Potential damage to both economies, risks to jobs, even the possibility of higher food prices, given how much agricultural trade happens between the two.
So what's the EU doing? Pushing back?
Well, the EU has been advocating for de-escalation, using established channels like the World Trade Organization, the WTO,
Right.
which helps resolve these kinds of disputes, and also through direct diplomatic channels. We even saw a delegation from the European Parliament travel to the U.S. Congress for talks.
And what about that 90-day pause on the tariffs? Is that seen as a real window for negotiation or something else?
That's a good question. Some analysis suggests the pause it might just be giving companies time to reorganize their supply chains, to lessen the impact if or when the tariffs actually hit hard.
So strategic maneuvering by the U.S. perhaps?
Could be. On the flip side, there's also the argument that any retaliatory tariffs the EU might impose will ultimately just increase costs for EU consumers themselves. It's a really complex situation, lots of potential knock-on effects.
It really sounds like it. And it seems this whole situation might be creating some interesting dynamics within Europe itself. I read something about it potentially fostering greater European unity, maybe even closer UK-EU cooperation. That feels a bit unexpected.
It is an interesting angle. The idea is that facing a common external challenge like this can sometimes, push nations to work together more closely.
A common enemy, so to speak.
Sort of, but there's also the counter-argument. Some say Trump's actions might actually be a wake-up call for Europe, a nudge to address its own issues with productivity, competitiveness, so there's a real spectrum of opinions in Europe on how best to respond.
And lurking in the background, is there a worry that Maloney, despite trying to mediate, might end up prioritizing Italy's national interests over the EU bloc as a whole?
That's definitely a valid concern being voiced. It could certainly complicate things if the EU doesn't present a completely united front.
Especially if, as you said, EU negotiators haven't even seen the U.S. demands yet. That suggests maybe a preference for bilateral talks rather than a unified EU approach.
It could point that way, yes. Adds to the uncertainty.
Okay, let's turn our attention across the channel then. What's the UK's perspective on all this potential US-EU trade activity, especially with these new tariffs in the mix?
Well, public opinion in the UK, according to one recent poll, seems to lean pretty strongly towards prioritizing trade with the EU over the USA.
Really? By how much?
By about a 2-to-1 margin, apparently. And there's also this feeling that the UK shares more similar values with the EU, and there's greater trust in both the EU and Japan when it comes to trade, significantly more than in the US.
That's quite telling, especially when you look at voters who maybe switched from conservative to labor recently.
Exactly. They apparently feel even more strongly about strengthening ties with the EU. It suggests a growing public appetite for closer economic links with Europe, particularly given all this global trade instability.
And is that reflected in business or political circles?
Well, the UK Trade and Business Commission has emphasized the need to strengthen those EU ties in what they see as an increasingly unpredictable global environment.
So the general mood seems to be leaning towards Europe. But what about trying to balance both, prioritizing both the US and the EU?
Well, some argue that trying to do both at the same time could lead to a sort of worst of all worlds situation, diluting the benefits you might get from a closer relationship with either one.
A tricky balancing act.
It is. The view from some quarters is that working with the US but in concert with European allies might actually be the stronger approach. Others stress that the quickest way to lower costs for UK businesses and consumers is simply focusing on reducing those post-Brexit trade barriers with the EU.
It sounds like the UK is in a slightly precarious spot then, trying to navigate its relationships with both these huge economic powers while they might be shifting their own alignments.
Precisely. And all of this, of course, has broader implications, wider ripples for global trade. How might a US-EU trade deal, assuming it happens, affect the ongoing trade tensions with China, for example?
That's a huge question. Could a US-EU agreement actually pressure Europe to further de-risk, reduce reliance on China in key areas?
Or even decouple, which implies a much more significant separation of economic ties.
Right. Some analysts have suggested that it feels like these potential deals could really trigger some major shifts in global trade patterns.
It certainly could. And we also have to remember President Trump's wider criticisms of Europe, don't we? It's not just about trade. It's immigration, it's defense spending within NATO. These are all tangled up together and likely to influence any future talks.
And then there are the different political stances on major world events, like the Russia-Ukraine war. Meloni's been a pretty staunch ally of Zelensky.
She has, whereas Trump's views have been, well, notably different. He said he's not a big fan. That kind of divergence on such a major geopolitical issue could definitely play a role in shaping the dynamics of trade discussions, too.
Absolutely. So, okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems clear that while that Trump-Meloni meeting injected some optimism about a US-EU trade deal, that optimism exists alongside, well, considerable underlying tensions. And very different viewpoints, not just between the US and EU, but also within Europe and in the UK, about their own priorities and the best way forward.
Exactly. And while there's talk of a deal being highly probable, 100% even, the actual specifics, they remain very unclear. And that 90-day pause on tariffs adds a sense of urgency, but it also leaves a huge amount of room for speculation for potential shifts in position.
And for you listening in, understanding these evolving global trade dynamics is, well, it's going to be increasingly crucial, isn't it, for navigating the current economic landscape, whatever your specific field or interest might be.
Absolutely. These potential agreements and the reactions they're sparking, they're going to have far-reaching consequences.
So maybe here's a final thought for everyone to consider. Given all these competing priorities, the sheer complexity involved, is a truly fair, comprehensive trade deal between the US and the EU even, realistic?
Or are we more likely looking at a series of compromises, strategic realignments perhaps?
And what could be the long-term impact of those realignments on the global balance of power? Definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.